How does a nation go from total nuclear ruin to ruling the global economy in just 30 years? In the 1930s, Japan was a resource-starved island with an invincible military and a divine emperor. They gambled everything on a single strike at Pearl Harbor, only to touch the very edge of extinction in 1945. But the fall was only the beginning. From the ashes of Hiroshima to the neon streets of modern Tokyo, this is the true, documented chronicle of the most miraculous rebirth in human history. No myths, no exaggerations, just the raw archives of a nation that learned to win through the power of the mind rather than the sword. Welcome to the War Archives. This is the story of the rising sun. In the vast theater of human history, few stories are as haunting, as violent, or as miraculously transformative as the rise, fall, and rebirth of the Empire of Japan. It is a story that begins not with a bang, but with a desperate, suffocating need for survival. In the late 1930s, Japan was a nation trapped by its own ambitions and a world that was rapidly closing its doors. They were the Britain of the East, an island nation with a modern industry, a divine emperor, and a military that believed it was invincible. But they lacked the one thing that makes a modern empire breathe: resources. This is the chronicle of a nation that gambled everything on a single strike, touched the very edge of total extinction, and then taught the world how to win through the power of the mind rather than the sword. The European War presented the Japanese leadership with a series of tempting, almost irresistible opportunities. As Nazi Germany's panzers tore through France and targeted the Soviet Union in 1941, the world's colonial maps were being redrawn in blood. Tokyo found itself torn between two paths. The Germans were screaming for their Japanese allies to join the crusade against the Soviets in the north. But the Japanese military had its eyes on a much richer prize: the European colonial territories to the south. In 1940, Japan moved to block the supplies of the Chinese nationalists by occupying northern Indochina. By July 1941, they doubled down, announcing a joint protectorate with Vichy France over the entire colony. It was a strategic masterstroke that opened the gates to all of Southeast Asia. But it was also a move that provoked a sleeping giant. The United States did not wait for a formal declaration of war. They struck back with a diplomatic and economic sledgehammer. Washington froze all Japanese assets and slapped a total embargo on oil shipments. For a nation like Japan, which imported 80% of its oil from American shores, this was a death sentence. The clock was now ticking. Tokyo faced a brutal binary choice: withdraw from Indochina and potentially China in a humiliating defeat, or seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies by force. The second Konoye cabinet tried to dance on the edge of the abyss. Prime Minister Konoye was desperate for a personal meeting with President Roosevelt, hoping that a face-to-face summit could provide the concessions he needed to keep the Japanese military hawks at bay. But the American State Department was cold. They refused to even sit at the table until Japan made prior concessions. It was a diplomatic stalemate. Konoye, realizing he had failed to prevent the inevitable, resigned in October 1941. He was immediately succeeded by his war minister, a man whose name would become synonymous with Japanese aggression: General Tojo Hideki. The final offer from Japan was rejected by Secretary of State Hull. Japan promised to leave Indochina only after China was conquered, provided the United States resumed oil shipments. Washington said no. The decision for war was made. Even as the negotiators in Washington continued their hollow talks, the Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force, was already steaming across the North Pacific toward a quiet harbor in Hawaii. Japan's war aim was grand: a new order in East Asia. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was sold as a noble crusade: East Asia for the Asiatics. a promise to destroy the old colonial masters and unite Manchuria, Korea, and North China into a glorious economic bloc. But in the cold reality of the battlefield, the slogan really meant East Asia for Japan. On December 7th, 1941, or December 8th, according to the calendar in Tokyo, the world changed in a single morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor achieved a level of surprise and tactical success that was almost unprecedented in naval history. But it was a hollow victory. While the Japanese air crews cheered over the burning hulls of the American battleships, they had unwittingly achieved the one thing Japan could not afford. They had unified American public opinion into a singular, burning determination to see the war through to the bitter end. The Japanese High Command had made a fatal calculation. They believed the soft Western democracies would be so discouraged by the high cost of a Pacific war that they would eventually sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan in control of its new empire. They were wrong. The United States fleet was rebuilt with a speed that defied logic, and the chain of Japanese defenses was breached long before the riches of the newly conquered territories could be sent back to Japan. Yet, for the first few months, the Japanese sun was at its zenith. In the Philippines, Japanese troops occupied Manila in January 1942. Though the defenders at Corregidor held out with legendary grit until May, the result was inevitable. Singapore, the impregnable pride of the British Empire, fell in February. By March, the Dutch East Indies and Rangoon were in Japanese hands. General Tojo's popularity reached fever pitch. He began to style himself as a fascist leader on the global stage. But the American Navy was not dead. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway cost the Japanese fleet 4 of its precious aircraft carriers and hundreds of its most seasoned pilots. It was a blow from which their naval aviation would never truly recover. Then came the 6-month meat grinder of Guadalcanal. By February 1943, the Japanese were forced to withdraw. For the first time, the empire was on the defensive. After Midway, the Japanese naval leaders knew the truth, even if they didn't dare speak it aloud. The war was lost. When the island of Saipan fell in July 1944, the reality became visible to the citizens of Tokyo. For the first time, American heavy bombers, the B-29 superfortresses, were within range of the home islands. The Tojo cabinet collapsed, replaced by Koiso Kuniaki. The government realized the end was coming, but they were paralyzed. The military refused any surrender that wasn't honorable, and the Japanese people, who had been told of nothing but glorious victories, were about to face a nightmare they could not imagine. In 1945, the firebombing raids began. These were not precision strikes. They were storms of napalm and magnesium that turned Japan's wooden cities into roaring furnaces. Every major city except the ancient cultural capital of Kyoto was systematically incinerated. Yet the generals remained bent on continuing the war, hoping that a decisive battle on Japanese soil would kill enough Americans to win better terms. By April 1945, the Americans landed on Okinawa. The Koiso government fell. The new premier, Admiral Suzuki Kantaro, was tasked with a singular mission: find a way out. They tried to reach out to the Soviet Union to act as a mediator, not knowing that the Soviets had already agreed at Yalta to join the war against them. The end came with the speed of light. On August 6, 1945, a single atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war and surged into Manchuria. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb leveled Nagasaki. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, once the pride of the empire, collapsed in days. Facing total annihilation, Emperor Hirohito did something no emperor had ever done. He intervened in politics. He insisted on surrender. On August 14th, the Pacific War came to an end. On September 2, 1945, Aboard the battleship United States Ship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender was signed. The empire of the rising sun was no more. Japan in 1945 was a hollow shell. Its cities were ash, its industrial capacity was gutted, and its people were facing a winter of mass starvation. For the next 7 years, the nation would be under the absolute control of the Allied military occupation, headed by a man who would become a modern-day shogun, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was the supreme commander for Allied Powers, or SCAP. While he was nominally directed by a multinational commission, the occupation was an entirely American affair. Unlike Germany, Japan was not governed directly by foreign soldiers. MacArthur was brilliant enough to realize that to change Japan, he had to work through the existing Japanese government and its vast bureaucracy. The occupation was a period of social engineering on a scale never before seen. The goals were simple but revolutionary: demilitarization and democratization. MacArthur set out to ensure Japan would never again be a danger to world peace, while simultaneously building a political system where individual rights were guaranteed. He acted with the speed of a whirlwind. The armed forces were demobilized. Millions of soldiers and civilians were brought home from across the fallen empire. The secret police were abolished. The Education Ministry's power was curtailed. Nationalist organizations were wiped out. An international tribunal was established, and, in the end, 7 men, including the wartime Prime Minister Tojo, were convicted and hanged. But MacArthur's greatest trick was not what he destroyed, but what he preserved. He kept the emperor, but stripped him of his divinity. He turned the throne into a tool for peace. The most significant achievement of the occupation was the new Constitution of 1947. When the Japanese government's own attempts at a new document proved too weak, MacArthur's team wrote their own draft in a single week. This constitution was a radical break from the past. Sovereignty no longer lay with the emperor. It belonged to the people. It included a 31-article Bill of Rights and the world-famous Article 9. In this article, Japan renounced war as a sovereign right forever. They pledged that land, sea, and air forces would never be maintained. While the politicians argued, the SCAP was busy rebuilding the economy from the ground up. They launched a massive land reform program. Nearly half of Japan's farmers had been tenants, trapped in a cycle of poverty. The occupation forced landlords to sell their land to the government, which then sold it to the tenants on incredibly favorable terms. This created a new class of owner farmers who would become the bedrock of a stable, conservative democracy. They also targeted the zaibatsu, the giant family-owned industrial conglomerates that had powered the war. While the onset of the Cold War eventually saved many of these companies from total dissolution, their power was severely curtailed. A new labor movement was encouraged, and by 1947, a new Ministry of Labor was established. Social legislation gave women the right to vote and rewritten the Civil Code to allow for gender equality in inheritance and family life. Education was the final frontier. The Americans replaced the old elitist school system with the 6-3-3-4 structure we see today. They wanted to replace rote memorization with initiative and self-reliance. By the 1960s, the number of university graduates in Japan would be 4 times what it was before the war. On April 28, 1952, the Allied occupation of Japan officially came to an end. The nation had regained its sovereignty, but it was a country fundamentally altered. The Japan that returned to the international stage was significantly reduced in territory, but it was about to embark on an era of expansion that no military campaign could ever achieve. The spark for this transformation was, ironically, another conflict on the Asian mainland, the Korean War. Between 1950 and 1953, Japan became the vital staging area for United Nations forces. The sudden, massive flood of procurement orders for trucks, uniforms, steel, and services was described by many as a gift from the gods. It turned a decade of economic depression into a roaring recovery. By 1952, Japan had finally regained its pre-war industrial output. But they didn't stop there. Over the next 2 decades, the Japanese economy expanded at rates never before seen in human history, averaging 10% growth every single year, and sometimes climbing as high as 13%. The architect of this new era was Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato, who in 1960 launched the Income Doubling Plan. This was a revolutionary shift in thinking. The government took responsibility for social welfare, education, and vocational training, redefining growth to include the consumer as much as the producer. This was the birth of Japan Incorporated. The Ministry of Trade and Industry, known as MITI, provided the strategic guidance that moved the nation away from cheap textiles and toward high-quality, high-technology products. They focused on shipbuilding, electronics, precision optical equipment, steel, and automobiles. Because their old factories had been destroyed in the war, the Japanese built brand new facilities using the latest technology, often making them far more efficient than their competitors in the United States or Great Britain. They became obsessed with quality. Following the ideas of the American statistician W. Edward Deming, Made in Japan went from being a joke about cheap toys to a global gold standard for reliability. By 1965, for the first time in its modern history, Japan revealed a trade surplus. The student had become the master. As the factories roared to life, the very face of Japan began to change. Between 1952 and 1973, the nation plummeted to less than 20%. The Meiji period, 85% of Japanese lived in the countryside. By 1945, it was 50%. By 1970, it had plummeted to less than 20%. The village, the heart of traditional Japanese life for centuries, was being hollowed out. Millions of young men and women, lured by the bright lights of the city and the high wages of the factories, flooded into the Tokyo-Osaka industrial corridor. By 1972, 1 in every 4 Japanese citizens lived in this massive urban belt. This migration brought both prosperity and pain. Rural life became mechanized, with elderly parents and wives left to run family farms while the men worked in distant cities. In the cities, the miracle was built on the backs of workers living in what Westerners called rabbit hutches, tiny, cramped apartments with shared facilities. Land prices in major cities surged 25 times higher between 1955 and 1972, far outpacing the rise in wages. Yet the compensations were everywhere. A new mass consumer society was born. Every household wanted the 3 sacred treasures: a television, a refrigerator, and a washing machine. Later, these were replaced by the 3 C's: a color television, a car, and an air conditioner. American popular culture, jazz, rock music, baseball, and fast food became the soundtrack of urban Japan. The young generation, born after the war, turned increasingly to Hollywood and American fashions, creating a deep generational split with their parents who still clung to the values of the old hierarchy. Politically, the 1950s and 60s were defined by the absolute dominance of the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. Formed in 1955 from the merger of 2 conservative parties, the LDP created a powerful iron triangle of cooperation between politicians, bureaucrats, and big business. The party's base remained in the conservative countryside, fueled by agricultural subsidies, while its funding came from the massive industrial combines of the cities. This stability allowed for long-term economic planning, but it also sowed the seeds of a unique Japanese style of machine politics. Factions formed around powerful leaders who vied for the premiership, not based on ideology, but on their ability to distribute patronage and campaign funds. The opposition, led by the Japan Socialist Party, fought a losing battle. They campaigned against rearmament, against the presence of American military bases, and for the protection of the post-war Constitution. The most explosive moment came in 1960, when Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke, a man who had been a member of the wartime Tojo cabinet, forced through a revision of the Mutual Security Treaty with the United States. Gigantic public demonstrations, led by radicalized students, shook Tokyo for days. The protests were so intense that a planned visit by President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to be canceled, and Kishi was forced to resign. Yet, despite the anger on the streets, the treaty survived, and the LDP remained firmly in power, riding the wave of economic success that kept the majority of the public satisfied. Japan's return to the international community was a slow and delicate process. The 1951 peace treaty had stripped Japan of its empire, including Korea, Taiwan, and the Kuril Islands. The Soviet Union, however, refused to sign the treaty, leaving a lingering dispute over 4 small islands north of Hokkaido that remains unresolved even in the 21st century. Throughout the 1950s, Japan worked to rebuild its relations with its Asian neighbors. Reparations treaties were signed with Burma in 1954, the Philippines in 1956, and Indonesia in 1958. In late 1956, Japan was finally admitted to the United Nations, signaling its full return to the family of nations. The relationship with China was a particular challenge. Under pressure from Washington, Japan initially recognized the nationalist government on Taiwan. But as the 1960s progressed, trade with mainland China became an economic necessity that Tokyo could not ignore. When President Richard Nixon made his shock visit to Beijing in 1971 without informing his Japanese allies, it was known as the Nixon Shock. Tokyo quickly pivoted, normalizing relations with Beijing in 1972 and severing formal ties with Taiwan. By the early 1970s, Japan was no longer a client of the United States. It was a competitor. The trade surplus with the West was beginning to cause friction, and the world was starting to realize that the island nation they had defeated in 1945 was now an economic superpower that could challenge the dominance of the dollar. The era of easy, explosive growth came to a grinding halt in 1973. The OPEC oil embargo sent the Japanese economy into a tailspin. Dependent on the Middle East for almost all of its energy, Japan faced its first post-war recession. Panic buying of basic goods like toilet paper became a symbol of the nation's essential fragility. But Japan did what it does best. It adapted. They realized that the era of heavy manufacturing and cheap energy was over. The government and industry pivoted toward energy efficiency and high technology. They began to produce fuel-efficient cars that conquered the American market during the gas shortages of the 1970s. They moved into semiconductors, robotics, and advanced electronics. By the 1980s, Japan had weathered the storm and emerged stronger than ever. Its per capita income surpassed that of the United States. It became the world's leading net creditor nation and the largest donor of foreign aid. This was the peak of the Japanese century. The 1980s in Japan were a time of unbridled optimism and dangerous speculation. This was the era of the bubble economy. Fueled by easy credit and a soaring yen, the prices of real estate and stocks reached astronomical levels. Japanese corporations began buying up iconic American landmarks, from Rockefeller Center to Pebble Beach Golf Course. In the midst of this madness, a historic era came to a close. In January 1989, Emperor Hirohito, the man in whose name the Pacific War had been fought, passed away after a 62-year reign. His death marked the end of the Showa era and the beginning of the Heisei era under his son, Akihito. But the Heisei name, which means achieving peace, would be tested almost immediately. In 1992, the bubble finally burst. Equity and real estate prices collapsed, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth. Japan entered what would become known as the lost decades, a long period of economic stagnation, deflation, and a loss of national confidence. The high-tech factories were still there, but the engine of growth had stalled. The 1990s were a decade of trauma for the Japanese psyche. In 1993, the LDP lost its majority for the first time in 38 years, leading to a period of political instability. In 1995, two events shook the nation to its core: the devastating Kobe earthquake, which killed more than 5,000 people, and the AUM Shinrikyo cult's sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. These events shattered the myth of Japan as a perfectly safe, perfectly ordered society. As the 21st century dawned, the nation faced a new, even more daunting challenge: demographics. The birth rate had fallen far below the replacement level. The population was aging faster than any other society on Earth. By the year 2000, the number of Japanese over 65 surpassed those under 15. Politically, a new kind of leader emerged in 2001, Koizumi Junichiro. He promised to break the LDP and implement sweeping economic reforms. He was a populist who captured the public imagination, but even his reforms could not fully restart the economic engine. He also pushed for a more activist foreign policy, sending non-combat troops to Iraq in 2003, the first time Japanese military units had entered a war zone since 1945. It was a watershed moment that ignited a fierce debate over the future of Article 9. On March 11, 2011, Japan faced its greatest crisis since the end of the Second World War. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in the country, triggered a massive tsunami that inundated the northeast coast. Nearly 20,000 people were killed or went missing. The tsunami also caused a catastrophic nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi power station. It was a triple disaster that forced the evacuation of tens of thousands and led to a nationwide shutdown of nuclear power. The government was heavily criticized for its handling of the emergency, and the crisis eventually led to the fall of the Democratic Party of Japan and the return of the LDP under Abe Shinzo in late 2012. Abe launched a bold economic program known as Abenomics, aimed at ending deflation and reviving growth. He also sought to redefine Japan's security role in the face of a rising and more assertive China. Under his leadership, Japan began to move toward collective self-defense, a controversial shift that remains a point of deep contention in Japanese society. Today, Japan stands as a high-technology, urban, industrial marvel, but it is a nation in a quiet transition. Some 4/5 of the people live in urban areas, and the values of the city have fully replaced the values of the old village. While the society remains formally hierarchical, the degree of conformity is lessening. The young generation is more assertive, more individualistic, and less bound by the paternalistic corporate culture of their fathers. Gender relations are also undergoing a slow, often painful transition. Women now account for 40% of the workforce, but they still struggle to reach management positions in a culture that expects them to carry the primary burden of child care and household management. On the global stage, Japan is a firm advocate for free trade and a leader in international aid. Yet, the ghosts of the past still linger. Relations with China and South Korea are often strained by disputes over wartime conduct, history textbooks, and the Yasukuni Shrine. The Northern Territories dispute with Russia remains a wall that prevents a formal peace treaty nearly 80 years after the war ended. The story of Japan since 1945 is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It is a story of a nation that learned that true power does not come from the barrel of a gun or the conquest of territory, but from the innovation of its people and the strength of its institutions. As Japan faces the challenges of an aging population and a changing global order, it remains a unique synthesis of the ancient and the modern, a place where Shinto shrines stand in the shadow of neon skyscrapers, and where the values of the samurai are channeled into the precision of high technology. If you found this deep dive into the archives of the Rising Sun insightful, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this documentary with those who seek to understand the miraculous rebirth of a nation. What is your perspective on Japan's journey? Is their economic miracle a model for the world, or is their demographic challenge a warning for us all? Let us know in the comments below. To continue exploring the monumental events and archives of human history, subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching the War Archives. Until next time, keep exploring the past.